Okay, guys, welcome back to Chapter 2, Part 2, Population and Health. We've been talking about death and death rates and how that changes and crude birth rates and crude death rates. Let's kind of continue down that same path and let's talk about deaths to babies. Not to make fun of that, I shouldn't have done that, but infant mortality rate is also a clear indicator of health provision and healthcare access. It also says something about women's empowerment, how much choice a woman has over her own body. And we can see stark differences. If you look at crude birth rates and the map from the previous recording, you'll see that it resembles this map of infant mortality rates across the world. So countries that are more rural, countries that are more impoverished, countries that have less connection to cities and healthcare provision are the countries where you find higher infant mortality rates. However, let's shift the script on this one a little bit. In 1960, the United States had an infant mortality rate of about 26 deaths per 1,000 live births. So notice that this measures deaths to children within their first year of life compared to all of the births that happened during that same year. Okay, so this is not a measure of the total population, but it's a comparison of which children survive in that first year. So in 1960, this was a really high number for the United States. There is economic disparity today in 2025, but there was even more economic disparity in 1960, especially along racial and ethnic lines. The kind of care that you would get in a rural hospital, especially, say, in the Deep South and places like Mississippi and Louisiana and Alabama and Tennessee, would be miles away, not just by distance, but in terms of quality of care, to what somebody would get if they were in suburban Chicago, for example. Okay, so again, those differences still exist, but they're actually less pronounced today in 2025 than they were then. And let me show you what I mean. So that infant mortality rate has dropped from 26 to 5.5. Okay, so that is a wholesale difference. That is like two different planets, especially if that connects to your own family. Right? So a child that's born has a really overwhelming chance of making it to their first birthday. That's not true in many countries of the world where infant mortality rates are still high. However, those same improvements, let's say, are happening on every corner of the world. I know it's easy to get stuck in gloom and doom and to feel like there's more tragedy in the 21st century than ever before, but the reality is that in terms of almost every single healthcare indicator across the planet, whether it's life expectancy or infant mortality or income or fertility rates, we have seen improvements in every corner of the planet. Now, there's some places where there are exceptions, right? In the midst of a civil war or what's happening in Gaza today, which may not be happening as you watch this video, right? But there are large-scale deaths and starvation that are happening. Infant mortality rates have gone through the roof during that time. And perhaps the same thing is happening in the Ukraine during its war with Russia. I don't know about that one as much. But nonetheless, there has been an improvement. There's also been a marked improvement across all races and all ethnic groups in the United States. There still is a disparity between black women and white women, but those disparities have lessened over time, at least in terms of infant mortality rates. Let's talk about the total fertility rate. This is another measure of change across time. It's not a snapshot like a crude birth rate or a crude death rate. Instead, it's a predictor. So it's the number of children a woman will have throughout her lifetime or throughout her childbearing years, but it's really the same measure, right? So think to yourself, how many children do you want to have? Do you want to have children at all? How many children are in your family? How many children were in your parents' family? How many siblings did your grandmother or grandfather have? Right? There's a predictable pattern that's happened. And in essence, the total fertility rate has continued to come down over time. So for a population to maintain itself as a stable population, or what we call replacement level fertility, the total fertility rate needs to be 2.1. In other words, a woman needs to have 2.1 children across the whole country, on average, for that population just to maintain itself. Not to grow, not to shrink, but to maintain zero population growth. But what we've seen as it's spread across the country, this started in Europe, in countries like Spain and in France and in Italy. People stopped having children, right? Young people just were making choices not to have children. And that same idea has spread. It's diffused across the Atlantic Ocean. It has diffused into North America. It's diffused into Mexico, where fertility rates are now below 2.1, which is the replacement level. This is kind of miraculous because it's happened in the course of just one generation. So even one generation ago, the country of Brazil had exceedingly high fertility rates. It's the largest Catholic country in the world, right? And the Catholic faith has often looked down upon any form of birth control. And yet in one generation, as Brazil urbanized and as women had access to education, the same thing happens. As women have more access to education, access to more opportunities, more control over their bodies, and live in a more urban environment, they tend to have fewer children. Now, I say that not as a value judgment, right? It's up to each one of you to make these decisions on your own. But increasingly in the United States and much of the Western world, young people are choosing very often not to have children at all. And oftentimes that is a choice that's made more explicitly by a woman than it is by a man for obvious biological reasons. Right? So most of Latin America now has a fertility rate that's at or below replacement level fertility. Right? Many of these countries are actually shrinking in population, and we saw that when we looked at natural increase rate. If you have a negative rate, then it's declining. Right, crude death rates in Eastern Europe and crude death rates are remarkably high in Russia and Eastern Europe. Okay, so there's a lot going on here in just this one map, and some of these questions are very personal, right? But we're talking about this at a macro scale, at kind of the scale of the globe. There are dozens and dozens of places that have remarkably low total fertility rates. The United States, by the way, that figure is 1.62. You might ask yourself how a woman can have 0.62 children, but hopefully you can understand how averages work, right? So this is just an average across all women and all families in the United States. But let's keep going with this a little bit. We still do have countries where total fertility rate is very high. Again, most of these are places where people live in more rural settings, at higher levels of poverty, less access to education, and all that kind of stuff. Okay? And you can see the geographic pattern here. I don't need to point it out to you. It's very obvious, okay? It's not the whole of Africa. It's specifically sub-Saharan Africa and sort of Central Africa, where we have average number of children still above 6. But look at these places with well below replacement levels of fertility. Korea today stands as the country, and this is South Korea, with the lowest total fertility rate of anywhere on the planet. 0.72 is unheard of in the modern world, although it's not as unheard of anymore. What that means is that on average, each woman in Korea is not even having one child. They're having fewer than one child. So the most common scenario is for women not to have children at all. And if you do have children, to have only one. The same is true in Hong Kong, and you might notice that a lot of these are some of the most densely populated places on the planet that we talked about in our previous slide. Singapore, Puerto Rico, that one might surprise some people a little bit. People are choosing not to have nearly as many children in Puerto Rico as they did a generation and 2 generations ago. Ukraine is very low. China, for a whole set of reasons that we'll get into in a second. Malta, Andorra. Most of these are small, very densely populated islands or city-states, etc. But we do find really low fertility rates also in many parts of Europe. So much so that in many countries, there are actually incentives for you to have a child. If you want a quick way to earn a few $1,000s, I think you can earn $8,000 to $10,000. You just need to have a child in Italy. Of course, it's more complicated than that. You have to be a resident of Italy. You have to establish residency. You have to keep that child and raise that child in Italy. A lot of those incentives vary from place to place. So some of those incentives are taking place in southern Italy, where they really have a problem where people are not having children. But a number of countries have tried to offer incentives. In Nordic countries like Finland and Denmark and Sweden, you don't necessarily earn cash, but you can earn huge tax breaks by having children. If you're a woman, you receive really generous time at home, paid leave of at least 1 year, oftentimes more than 1 year, right? Paid time off in order to try to increase fertility levels. Sometimes those policies work, but usually they don't. As a matter of fact, even in the country of China, where people are allowed to have more than one child now, those numbers have not come back, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk about life expectancy. This is probably the single most important indicator for most people. How long do I get on this planet? How much time do I have? Of course, your life is just a blip, right? In the large scope of things, you get to live, however, a much longer time than almost any of your ancestors did. Life expectancy across the planet has continued to increase every year consistently for the last 100 or so years, with very few exceptions. And I don't have it on this chart, but in 1918, life expectancy dipped a little bit, and that's because we had a pandemic. The Spanish flu affected life expectancy. But for the most part, you can see the trajectory. So I just chose some countries that might be of interest. Canada is in the light blue, and then the United States in the darker blue, and Mexico in green. And you can see that there's this persistent movement upward of life expectancy across the last 80 plus years or so. But notice the market improvement that you have in Mexico, right? The difference between being born in Mexico and the United States, or Mexico and Canada, was like a different world. It was almost like a different planet, right? The life you could expect to live would vary by 15, 17, maybe even almost 20 years, based upon just the accident of geography. And during this time, as we can see, 1919 through 22, we understand what happened here. Life expectancy dropped off during this time, and we understand why, right? That's purely due to the COVID pandemic. But look what happened beginning in 2023. In essence, if you erase this little blip on each of these trajectories, you can see that life expectancy has started to pick back up again. Although in the United States, we still haven't reached the level that we were at just before the pandemic, and it remains to be seen whether that will happen again. One of the things that's affecting life expectancy in the United States, besides that temporary COVID pandemic, which still exists but in a much less serious way, is that we have other factors that have been killing more people in recent years. The opioid epidemic, for example, has risen to the level of being one of the leading killers of people in the age group of college students from the ages between 15 and 25, for example. It's one of the leading killers. Suicide rates have increased dramatically, also among that same age group. And then finally, we have the issue of obesity, right? Something that the current administration is trying to address by improving the kinds of foods that people eat and the kind of exercise that they get. So let's look at some of the highest and lowest, just like we did before, just kind of for fun. And not coincidentally, many of the countries with the highest life expectancies also are small countries, countries with high population densities, with maybe very strong governments, but also a strong sense of community. A lot of these places are much more walkable. Maybe that has something to do with life expectancy. A lot of these places have fully funded, government-sponsored access to health care. So that explains part of these really high life expectancies. We also need to talk about diet, right? The kinds of foods that are eaten in Japan, in Andorra, and in Spain and Italy are far different than the kind of foods that the typical American would eat. But in the United States, the life expectancy, well, I guess we saw it on the last slide, is about 78 or 79. We also have major differences in the United States among gender and among race and among ethnic group. So you can see the chart for yourself, but notice just how stark the differences are So overall life expectancy in 2022 was about 77.5. That's come up a little bit in 2023 and 2024. I just didn't have good data to present on it. So we're closer to about 79, maybe 78 or 79. But there is this big difference between men and women among all races, about 5.5 years or so. So women get to live longer. And that's true in almost every country across the planet. It's true across history. And there are a lot of reasons for it. Men maybe make riskier choices when they're young, and some of them get taken out earlier than women do. War always takes more men, but then there are other things like women tend to take their own health care a little bit more seriously and take action than men do. Okay, moving on from that, you can take a look at this data and make sense of it yourself, but this bottom category is American Indian and Native Alaskans, and you can see that they have the lowest life expectancy of any racial or ethnic group among both genders. The difference between being an Asian woman and a black man is also very stark, right? And so there are connections to all sorts of things here, some of the things that I've kind of mentioned already. But the life expectancy for an Asian woman, even in the United States, is incredibly high, right? It's higher than it is even in many Asian countries where life expectancy in general is higher. So there's a whole bunch of complicated reasons for that, and hopefully you can think through those. If you're curious about it, go look it up. Use Google, use ChatGPT, and click on links and see what you think of it, right? This is just a general course. I wish we had more time to go deeper, and sometimes I'm going deeper than I should already. There are also geographic differences in life expectancy across the United States. So the areas with the lowest life expectancies in the United States, this would be a good test question and quiz question, are in kind of three areas. The first one are in areas with high levels of Native Americans. So the Lakota Nation in North and South Dakota has some of the lowest life expectancies anywhere in the United States. And the next area is along the Mississippi River and the Mississippi Delta. Hopefully you can see my highlighter here. Okay, a lot of these areas are rural and poor and have lower levels of education. This also happens to be a legacy of the slave trade, right? So housing conditions and health conditions, a whole set of things that were really substandard in the 1800s continue to be substandard today. And then the next area is in Appalachia. Okay, so over here in eastern Kentucky and in West Virginia. And again, this is a function of isolation, of rural living, lack of access to jobs and economic development. A lot of people move away from both of these areas for those reasons. But let's keep going. So another way to analyze and get a quick snapshot of any place, whether it's a town, a county, a country, or a region, is through the use of something called a population pyramid. And maybe you've encountered these before in another class or in other areas of your life. It's really just a graph, but it's given to you in snapshot and pyramid form. So it's a moment in time that shows what the population structure of any place looks like. Remember this idea that demography is destiny, right? So looking at these population pyramids, we can articulate all sorts of things about that place. A traditional population pyramid looks like this one from Niger from 2022, right? And what I mean is that it truly is in the shape of a pyramid, right? Because this is a snapshot of people by by sex and by age category. And so in a traditional population pyramid, there are always going to be more babies than there are people living into their older years of life, because you're born here, and then with each successive generation, there are deaths that happen along the way. Okay, so this is what Niger's population pyramid looks like in 2022. What we can ascertain from that is that there is massive population growth happening, that the natural increase rate, or the rate of natural increase, is very high in Niger, which tracks. It makes sense that it's in sub-Saharan Africa. What else can we tell from these? We can look at China, and we can see various moments in time where there were a lot of births, right? About 50 to 60 years ago. There were really high levels of births. And what did China do? They responded in kind because they were fearful of how much population growth they were experiencing. And so shortly thereafter, they implemented the one-child policy. And you can see the effects of that as there are fewer and fewer children born because families were restricted and were only allowed to have one child each. And you can see that in the strange kind of shape of this pyramid. Notice the United States, which right here, this is 2022, right? Very recent data. And you'll notice that there's sort of consistency both among men and women, but you also start to see this trailing off. So fewer and fewer children being born across these last several decades, right? Fewer in each year than the year before and each 5 years before. In the long term, what that means is we're going to have this group of people, and this is projected for 2025, that are making their way into middle age, right? So by 2055, we're going to have far more people that are over the age of 45 than are under the age of 45. And I'll talk about that in more detail later. China is going to have a similar problem with a lot more people on the top of the pyramid than at the bottom. Okay, so that's kind of an introduction to basic population pyramids. But what else can we kind of glean from them besides the age of people? Well, quite a lot, actually. So Japan is a special case. Maybe you've heard this elsewhere, but Japan is moving from a traditional population pyramid in 1950, when there were still more children being born than there were in older age categories. But by 2005, Japan's fertility rate had dropped precipitously to below 1. And in 2055, this is the projection. And so if this is a population pyramid, many experts are calling this form in 2055 a population coffin. And think about the implications for a society that has so many older people. It affects the way that elections work. Just as a quick example, in the United States, we're having something similar with far more people over the age of 65 than we've ever had, as both a percentage and as an absolute number. And people over the age of 65, they always tend to vote. And who have they voted for president? Overwhelmingly in the last 2 elections, really the last 3 elections. They voted for the 3 oldest presidents that we've ever had in the history of our country. Trump 1, Biden, and then Trump 2. Is that something that's going to continue? Well, the population pyramids might predict that it will. So Japan is in a similar boat, right? The people with real power, democratic power, and also money and demographic power are those in the older age categories. That means that policies for younger Japanese might be overlooked. Okay, and there's a million different things we could say about that. But demography is destiny. So let's see if you can make some educated guesses about a couple of population pyramids that I'm going to show you here. This first one has a clear skewing effect, right? And so take a look at those age categories and see if you can think about what kind of place this might be. This is not a country. This is a town in the United States of America. And surprise, surprise, it's a town in Florida. So hold that thought for a second, see if your guess is right. And let's move to another kind of funky looking population pyramid. And this one is also very skewed, but it's skewed kind of in the opposite direction. This also is a town, not a state or a country. And you might be able to make guesses about what kind of town that is. So let's give you a clue, right? This first one on the top is a town called The Villages in Florida. It's filled with housing units that are designed for people 55 and older. These are retirement communities. And so not only can we say that, oh, there are a lot of people in this age category, but we can also make judgments about what kinds of things we're going to see in the landscape there. Right? This is a geography class after all. So what kinds of things would you expect to find in this town? Probably a lot of dinner buffets that start serving dinner at 4 or 4:30 or 5. If you're an orthopedic surgeon, this would be a great place for you to set up shop. If you're a heart doctor, if you're a heart specialist, if you are in the financial planning business or estate planning business, this is your place. Okay, so there's a lot more to it than just saying, there's a lot of old people there. And what about this one down here? You can probably guess it. On the landscape, you're going to see a whole different set of businesses and signs that are setting up shop in this town. So this is the town of Columbia, Missouri. Hence, everybody, well, the vast majority of people are between the ages of 20 and 24. So what are you going to see in this town? You're going to see a lot of cheap drink specials, like at this bar. You're going to see a lot of tequila. You're going to see a lot of liquor stores. You're also going to see tattoo parlors and maybe henna tattoo spots and vape shops, right? Anything that appeals to people in this age category. You're also going to see a lot of sporting goods stores, maybe, and things like that. Maybe a lot of public space. Okay? So most of America don't look like these places, of course, but a lot of places have their own unique dynamic. So using population pyramids, we can model the way that population structures change over time. And so we have something called the demographic transition model. And this is an important part of the entire chapter. It's described in detail in the textbook, so I'm going to go through it relatively quickly. But here's one of the things that I'd like to sort of offer about this model. If you look across the entire planet now at 8.1 billion people, and you think about every different kind of religion and culture and food and population density and specific geographies, climate regions, one of the things that has been consistent, no matter what culture or religion or language is spoken there, is that every country has sort of passed through a predictable pattern of population. And let me show you what I mean. So in stage one, we have that population pyramid like I described. It's the typical population pyramid. If you look at a population pyramid of ants or of any creature in nature, it will look like this, right? There are always more babies born than there are people age 5, and there are always more people age 5 than there are age 10, etc. Okay, so this is what humanity looked like for most of our existence, for hundreds of thousands of years, right? We were very much like other creatures out there. And so we had really high birth rates and really high death rates. They sort of canceled each other out. And so the population growth rate was practically zero. As a matter of fact, there were times when humanity almost ceased to exist, sometime around 100,000 years ago. Okay, but we fought our way back. And stage two is a moment in time when humanity begins to organize itself. We discover organized agriculture. We begin to feed ourselves. We don't suffer from famine nearly as much as previous generations had. And so what happens is the death rate starts to decline really fast. We learn how to build houses and shelter ourselves from hurricanes. We learn what's safe to eat and what's not safe to eat. So during stage two, what happens is that the death rate comes way down, but people do not change their fertility behavior. They continue to have sex with each other, right, at the same rate, and the babies keep coming out. But those babies survive longer. In many traditional societies, infant mortality rate is so high that babies wouldn't even be given names. I've seen this firsthand myself in parts of Southeast Asia. So the child doesn't receive a name until their first birthday because infant mortality rate is so high. And sort of that's what happens during stage two. But then those children start to survive. And so what do we see to the natural increase rate? The population starts to soar and it grows really fast. Okay, so there are basically no countries on the planet that are still in stage two. Even countries with the highest fertility rates like Yemen and Chad and Niger have seen drops in the birth rate. So they're in stage three. In stage three, we have higher levels of education. We have access to birth control. We have more information. We have women's empowerment. We have opportunity for women. We have other things that people spend their time doing in the realization and the confidence that their children are going to survive their childhood and into adulthood. And so families begin to choose to have fewer children. The birth rate comes down. Okay, this is what's been happening in the planet across the last 50 years, as if I haven't talked about it enough, right? Okay, so the birth rate comes down, but even as the birth rate comes down, population growth continues to increase because there are so many people in that age category having children. Even though they're having fewer children than their parents had, the population continues to sort of explode. So as a planet, we are in the late stages of stage 3. Okay, that would be another good test question right there. So we're almost at stage 4, right? So our population is continuing to increase, but it's increasing, remember what I said before, at a decreasing rate, right? So we're somewhere up here where our population has reached that inflection point and it's increasing at a decreasing rate. And at some point, we're going to stabilize that. And interestingly enough, in stage 4, you notice that birth rates and death rates become about the same again, right? So we're kind of back where we started, except in this case, birth rates and death rates aren't high, they're both low, but they still start to cancel each other out. And so in stage 4, there's very little or no population growth. So total fertility rates stand at about 2 or 2.1, and there's very slow population growth. This is where the United States is right now. The United States is in stage 4. Our birth rates and death rates are almost the same as you saw from the population clock. However, there is this stage 5. This used to be called a potential stage 5, but now we are quite certain that there is a stage 5. Dozens and dozens of countries are now shrinking in population because there are more deaths each year than births. It's kind of a strange phenomena for any biological creature to choose not to repopulate, not to reproduce, right? That's kind of the life force that drives every living thing, except for humans, on the planet, and we're choosing to have fewer children. Maybe it's a natural response to a sense of a world that can't handle more population. Maybe it's a personal choice because people want to spend time doing other things other than raising children. They've realized how hard it is, which it is. But nonetheless, that's the model, okay? So certainly you can expect a couple of questions based upon this model. So learn it, read about it, study it. But let's move on. So we've got a couple of key concepts here that I've brought up before, right? There's this question of overpopulation. When the population of a region exceeds the carrying capacity of its environment, and the carrying capacity is self-evident. The fundamental concept that every environment has a limit to how many creatures or individuals it can support. And this question about the carrying capacity of the Earth is still an open one. We don't really know what it is. I've given you a few hints, right? For example, the population of the entire planet can fit inside of one county in the United States fairly comfortably. Each person can have 38 square feet to themselves. Okay? So we don't really have, it's not that we've run out of space, but the question has to do with resources. Is there enough food? Is there enough water? Is there enough access to materials that we need for housing moving into the future, given our population of 8.1 billion. So should human populations be managed or limited by governments? These are big questions. There are some governments that have engaged in pro-natalist policies. Pro-natalist policies are ones that encourage people to have children, and I mentioned a few of those before. Denmark, Sweden, Finland have all tried to encourage their people to have more children. In the United States, you're beginning to see something like this as well. Not necessarily through financial incentives, but sort of through cultural nudges. What about fertility limits? We have seen countries that felt like their population growth was out of control, and so they have placed limits on fertility in a variety of ways. What about family planning? This is something that has been pushed across the planet, and it's been successful at bringing fertility rates down, right? But there are a whole set of moral and ethical and kind of sociological questions about all these things, right? So I just want to put some of these ideas into your head. If we had class in person, we would talk a little bit more in depth about each of these, but for most of you, that's not the case. For some of you, it is. So China is a unique case, and China went through a period where they realized their population growth was too high, and China went through a period of massive famine during the communist era. Millions and millions of people starved to death because they couldn't keep up with demand for a whole set of complicated reasons. And so China implemented a one-child policy. But let me start with India first. India was noticing the same thing, but India is a democracy. It's not so easy for India to pass such a drastic measure as abolishing families or prohibiting families from having more than one child. So India's approach was much more, let's say, democratic and softer. But beginning in 1971, citizens were paid to be sterilized, right? So if you already had 2 or 3 children in some parts of India, you could apply to the government and the government would pay you a stipend to become sterilized or to have your tubes tied to prevent you from having future children. So it was the burden was still placed upon individuals, but they were given incentives not to have more children. There was much more emphasis on distributing family planning, things like, well, you know what those are. I don't need to tell you, right? This met with sort of limited success in the 1970s, and population continued to grow. China, as we know, beginning in 1990, implemented a one-child policy where families could only have one child. There were financial and other incentives to limit family size, and that's putting it gently, because China implemented family planning fees in this case. But let's put this in another way. Family planning fees were really penalties, and these were large penalties. If you were caught having a second child, you could be imprisoned. Your child could be taken away from you. You could pay a fine, which maybe doesn't sound like a big deal, but that fine could be the equivalent of half of your year's salary, or maybe the entirety of your year's salary. If you worked in a government job, you could lose that government job. It could be taken from you and would send you into abject poverty. So China didn't play around with this. This was a serious policy, and it had a serious impact on China's population. And as we saw previously, China's population is now shrinking, right, as a result of this one-child policy. Before I talk about this map, I do want to just mention that even when China ended the one-child policy, which it did a number of years ago now, something unpredicted happened. And that's that most families continued to only have one child. So even when the government restrictions were taken away, Chinese families tended to have only one or fewer children as the most common practice. That cultural norm had been set by the government, and it's continued. There's sort of this echoing effect. We don't know in the future if Chinese families will kind of go back to previous patterns, but very likely not, because most Chinese people have moved into cities. They've gained more wealth. They have higher levels of education, and we know what usually happens, but it's very difficult to predict the future. Okay, so moving on to this question or the implications of how population works and population structure. Let's talk about the youth dependency ratio. I have a definition here somewhere. There it is. This is a ratio of younger dependents, people younger than the age of 15, in a ratio to the working age population, or those between the ages of 15 and 64. So countries that have a high youth dependency ratio are countries where they had high fertility rates in the past and maybe still do, right? This is challenging for a huge number of reasons, right? As these children grow up in the countries that you can see in dark green on this map, there are questions about whether there will be enough jobs for those kids, the cost of raising children and the effort that it takes, and the amount of labor, particularly burdening women to do this work, takes women away from doing other things, like increasing their education or entering the labor force. So there are lots of implications for having large numbers of children. Again, if it's an agrarian society and there's enough land, then it's much easier to have large numbers of children than in urban societies. Okay? So this is a problem that's been known about for a long time, but let's talk about kind of the opposite of this. This is sort of the 21st century problem, and it's the elderly dependency ratio. That humanity has often become a victim of its own success, and it's not any truer than in this case of the elderly dependency ratio, which is the ratio of those older than the age of 64 compared to the working population of those between the ages of 15 and 64. And so you can see in much of Europe, they're sort of the leaders in this, right? They have a really high ratio of people over the age of 64 in comparison to their labor force. Japan has a serious issue with this, as does Italy. and Germany. All right, the implications hopefully are pretty clear to you, but there's a problem with not enough workers. The United States is starting to just now see the beginning edge of that, of not enough people in a certain age category, and you start to see that a lot of colleges in the United States are beginning to close. That's in part due to this elderly dependency ratio and not having enough children in those age categories, or not having enough demand because there aren't enough college-age people. It's just beginning to happen. One of the things you see in Japan, and you probably have seen videos somewhere else related to this, tons of mechanization in Japan, right? And you might say to yourself, well, yeah, the Japanese have always been good with technology, but it's also sort of forced into Japanese society because of a lack of human capital, of human labor, right? In the absence of young workers, Japan has opted for more technological solutions. So automated vending machines, self-driving cars, factories that are very automated. All of this happens in Japan. You're starting to see the same thing happen in other corners of the world as well. It's not just because of AI. It's not just because the technology exists. It's also a response to not having enough workers. So to end up the chapter, and we are getting to the end here, let's talk about some kind of bigger ideas, right? So I've talked about a lot of different elements. A lot of these are sort of straightforward, but the implications are trickier. And so I'm not going to read these quotes to you, but there are these kind of 4 philosophical baskets that you can put maybe your own ideas into about how you think about population and population growth, and about fertility and whether you should have kids or not, and whether it's okay for governments to control population patterns or not. Right? These are huge questions, and they've been around for a long time. So let me go to the next slide, and hopefully you got a chance to read those quotes. But we have to start with this guy named Thomas Malthus, and I don't always ask you to remember people's names, but I do want you to remember this person's name. He was a minister, and Thomas Malthus lived during the period of the Industrial Revolution, and he began to observe in Europe what was happening. And what was happening was that more children were surviving, death rates were declining, and population growth was increasing, right? So he observed this stage 2 of the demographic transition, and then kind of into stage 3. And he's the first one we have on record that sort of systematically wrote about this and actually tried to take counts and tried to apply math to this question. And he wrote this famous essay in 1798 called An Essay on the Principle of Population. And his argument was that population increases geometrically. That means population increases at an increasing rate, but food production can only increase arithmetically. His argument is that we're running out of food. His solution to that problem is that we need to talk to these young people about sex. We need to tell them to stop having it. Remember, he's a minister as well. And so he said the problem are all of these kind of crazy young people having too much sex. They've lost their morals. They're not like previous generations, and they're just doing crazy things, and they're having sex too much, and they're not thinking about the impact on the planet and upon society, and so they should stop. Right? So there's a lot of criticism to be laid at the feet of Malthus, but that was his idea. Neo-Malthusians come along a couple of hundred years later. So Neo-Malthusians come out of sort of the environmentalist movement of the 1960s. And they say, okay, Malthus might not have been entirely correct about population and resource allocation. But he was right about one thing, and that's that the environment can't handle all these people. That we need to stop having children, not just because of individual choice, but because of the good and the sustainability of the planet. They argue that the current food system is unsustainable, that all resources are running out, and it's not just about food, it's also about water and clean air and a whole bunch of other factors. The next argument here might sound a little strange to you. It's a Marxist and neo-Marxist argument, and the crux of this argument is that that Engels is writing in also shortly after the time of Malthus And it's a critique of Malthus's ideas, because Malthus very much is blaming the poor and the masses on overpopulation. The Marxists are making a different argument, and they're saying, look, it's political systems of privilege that provide plenty of resources to some and not enough to others. It's not really about the total amount of food that's available or resources. It's about the distribution of that food. And I'm not just talking about whether there's a road to distribute the food from point A to point B. I'm talking about wealth and poverty, that the industrial class kept the poverty class impoverished so that they will be willing to work. And that created sort of systems of starvation and deprivation. And, it wasn't good to be an impoverished worker in the 18th and 19th century in Europe. The cornucopians take on a whole different approach. They say, population problem, what do I think about the population? Their response is this: what population problem? There is no population problem, that it's all over bloated, it's over exaggerated, and that none of it is true. You might say to yourself, this seems like a little bit of an irresponsible way to think about the planet and about population. And yet cornucopians will say, let's look back at history, that there have always been predictions that the world was going to fall into famine and destruction and that the planet would explode. And yet, in each case, there's been some kind of technological discovery that has resolved and solved the food problem, that has solved the water problem. They point to things like desalinization of salt water to provide fresh water as an example, of hydroponic farming that's increased the output of food across the planet, etc. So Malthus's theory was that population would outstrip the amount of food that exists on the planet. And in essence, he was just wrong. He didn't foresee the implementation of technology that came about, our ability to use irrigation techniques and genetically modified seeds and to grow food in places where nobody in 18th or 19th century Europe could have predicted that food could be grown, right? Like on the tops of roofs or on the sides of buildings. And so in essence, Malthus is discounted in this way, right? He didn't foresee the future correctly. And that's what I have on this slide right here, so we can kind of slide past this one. The Neo-Malthusians have a more modern argument, right? This is born in the 20th century, and they argue that that even though people aren't starving in mass as much as Malthus had predicted that they were, the polar ice caps are melting as a result of human activity, that water tables are dropping across the planet, that soil is being depleted at levels never seen before in human history, and that this cannot continue, that ultimately this will result in massive destruction across the planet, and it will result in war and civil war and strife, and people will be fighting over resources like water and like oil and like access to land. The Marxist and socialist critique, which I've already discussed, are saying that, the wealthy never run out of food. As a matter of fact, they have more abundance, so much abundance that the biggest problem in the wealthy world is one of overabundance. It's one of boredom, of health problems associated with eating too much fat and too much sugar and too much steak, right? And so Marxists argue it's always been that way. So there is poverty, there is a lack of access to resources, but it's not because those resources don't exist. It's not because there's not enough food produced on the planet, but rather some have access, easy access due to their wealth, to everything on the planet, and others are very, very limited. And so this map simply shows which countries are able to take advantage of global trade and have plenty of access to cheap and accessible food and all sorts of other products, and who cannot. So there are those that gain from international trade, and there are those that miss out from international trade. And the implications for this map, I will leave it to you to think about. The cornucopians are sort of an interesting group of people, an interesting set of ideas. right? The argument is that actually, not only is there not a population problem, but the real population problem is that there aren't enough children being born, and that it's the responsibility of certain people to make as many babies as they can, right? And maybe you know who that's referring to a little bit, right? But that people should have more children. The argument is that the more children you have, the higher the likelihood that you're going to produce the next Einstein, or the next Nobel Prize winner, or the next, I don't know, Zuckerberg or something that's going to create something that nobody else had created before. And so we should keep populating the planet in order to find new ways to deal with population growth. Technology will solve all of the problems. The sky is not falling, according to the cornucopians. All right, so maybe your ideas fall into one of these four categories, or maybe you borrow a little bit from each of them. In reality, even though some of them sound like ridiculous arguments, there are grains of truth in all of them. And part of the idea of being a college-educated graduate at some point is that you're able to hold multiple seemingly conflicting ideas in your head at the same time, right? And that's true of population. People that are overly simplistic about these problems don't understand how diverse the problems are and how these problems manifest differently at different times and in different corners of the planet. There are places where having large numbers of children makes sense, and there are places where it absolutely doesn't, because land scarcity is real. All right. So I mentioned this before, but what we see with the aging of the world's population is that the problems we face as a planet are very different than they were 50 or 100 years ago. So the incidence of diabetes has become a global, serious problem. So much so that in 2021, there were an estimated 6.7 million deaths attributable to diabetes or the complications of diabetes, right? That is a global epidemic of sorts. And this number is expected to rise to 8.5 million by 2045. So if you were able to go back 100 years in a time machine and tell people that, hey man, the biggest threat to people in 2025 is that we're all, not all, but many of us are going to have too much. We're going to have too much money. We're going to be able to drive our cars everywhere. We won't have to walk anywhere. We're going to be able to eat as much food as we want relatively cheaply. And that's going to make most of us fat and overweight, and it's going to cause diabetes, which is going to cause problems in the way that our internal systems function. They would have said you're crazy, right? But that's where we are in 2025. Meanwhile, in other parts of the world, kind of ancient and well-known, well-established, and very solvable problems like malaria continue to persist, especially in certain parts of Africa, sort of the mid-latitudes, tropic regions. I should say the low latitudes, right near the equator. And yet we are seeing improvements each year. The number of those who died from malaria in 2020 was about 625,000 people, and we're seeing that decline to less than 600,000 in 2023. And it's the hope of the planet that those numbers will continue to decrease. But again, there's a known solution to these problems. And so the part of the reason that I'm ending this lecture on these two slides is to show the deep contrast between sort of the problems faced by the developed world and those faced by developing countries, more rural settings. Okay? So in the end, after all these models and all these predictions and all these population pyramids, it's incredibly essential to again think about this in a more nuanced way than maybe what you hear on YouTube or in the news. Okay, so we do have really good predictive models about how population works. But on the other hand, at any given moment, Mother Nature can strike back, and Mother Nature can strike back really fast. And she usually does. Right? So in the 14th century, right, given the fact that we didn't have as much knowledge and technology, obviously, but Europe lost between 30 and 50% of its population to the Black Death or the Black Plague. Moving ahead, as recently as 2004, the country of Zimbabwe, near the southern tip of Africa, experienced something that maybe you might be able to predict, in which its population started to decline. Its natural increase rate dropped below 0%, and they were losing population during these 2 years. And it was 100% due to the AIDS epidemic, which took hold in Zimbabwe and much of sub-Saharan Africa, right? It was a disease that didn't have a cure. We still don't have a cure for AIDS, but we have developed treatment plans that are very, very effective. And finally, smallpox exposure killed an estimated 39% of the entire Aztec population in the New World, mostly in Mexico and in other parts of Central America. 50% of Native American people in North America died as a result of new diseases that were introduced by a European encounter, and 100% of certain indigenous groups in the Caribbean disappeared off the face of the earth because of disease. And so I end with this slide not to be a doomsday sort of prognosticator, but in order to just reconstitute this idea that humans' connection to the earth and the natural elements of the earth can change in a moment's notice. Most of us lived through the COVID pandemic, and I'll talk about that at the end of the semester, right? Which was a huge impact across the planet until we found a cure. And so at any moment, something similar could happen. Hopefully we have enough technology and enough education and enough collaboration across the planet to mitigate the damage of a lot of those things. But we just don't know, right? Predicting the future is always very risky. So with that, we have ended chapter 2. I know this one was very long. Some of the future chapters will be shorter than this one. Take care, everybody.